Alex Korb. I'm a neuroscientist. I do research on depression. I just wrote a book called The Upward Spiral, which this talk is based on. It's about what's happening in the brain in depression and what you can do about it. Subtitle, Using Neuroscience to Reverse the Course of Depression, One Small Change at a Time. So today that's what I'm going to talk about. So, we all sort of, I guess, show of hands, who is familiar with the DSM definition of depression? Sort of see it. Okay, great. So this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for, psychologists diagnosing depression. We know, what all the symptoms of depression are. This list sort of doesn't capture what exactly is happening in the brain in depression. And that's really what I want to focus on. In order to understand what's happening in the brain in depression, we sort of need to understand a little bit something about how the brain works in the first place. Your brain is full of intricate and interacting neural circuits. If you can sort of picture, for example, like when you flip to the back of an in-flight, when you take an airplane flight, flip to the back of an in-flight magazine, and you can sort of see, where that airplane flies to, and it flies. There's all these little lines crisscrossing the country. That's sort of how your brain works. You have all these networks that are interacting with each other, and there's circuits for planning and worrying. There's circuits for enjoyment and mood and memory. There's circuits for habits and, importantly, addiction, and circuits for pain and sleep, and all these different, pretty much everything that's going on in your life. And importantly, to understand, we all have the same circuits, regardless of whether you have depression or not. And the tuning of those circuits varies differently between people. In the worrying circuit, some people worry more, some people worry less. Some people are more decisive, some people are completely indecisive, can't decide where they want to go to lunch every day. And on all of these different circuits, they're interacting, and based on the tuning of your individual circuits, that increases or decreases your likelihood of developing depression. But there's all, it's all sort of natural variation. And the important thing to recognize is that there's no brain scan that can diagnose depression. There's no lab test or EEG or MRI that can tell you whether someone is depressed or not. Yes, we have a lot of studies based on groups of on average, people with depression have higher activity here, on lower activity there, and that's what has developed our understanding of the neuroscience of depression. But on an individual basis, you can't tell by looking at someone's brain or their neurotransmitters whether or not they are depressed, because there is so much overlap. So what we do know is that it's really more of like a software problem. Obviously, whenever you're talking about the brain, maybe not obviously, the software and the hardware very much interact. But in the brain, we know that depression is a pattern of activity and reactivity of all those circuits that the brain gets stuck in. Okay, and that might sound like kind of abstract, but it's really a problem with how the thinking and the feeling circuits of the brain are miscommunicating. They're supposed to have a certain pattern of dynamic communication, and there's something that's out of whack. To give you perhaps a more concrete example of how that could happen, I like to think of traffic, because that's something we all in LA have experience with.
Very depressing.
Yes. Not only is it depressing, but it's similar. Traffic has a lot of similar properties to the brain. The brain is a complex, dynamic system, and all these different parts that are interacting are sort of like, the dynamic interaction of cars on a freeway, or other complex systems like weather or the stock market. And what can happen is you can have these patterns that just sort of happen and arise out of nowhere simply from the interaction of all the pieces in the puzzle. Like, you like to think of traffic jams as happening for a specific cause, right? You're like driving down the freeway, you're inching along, oh my God, there must be any construction. There must have been a bad accident, now it's down to 2 lanes. And then all of a sudden, traffic goes away and you're just on your way. And I think that is very similar to how depression works. Like, we think of someone's depressed for a reason. Their spouse died or they lost their job. And it's true that those can trigger these patterns of activity, but it's also true that people can just be depressed for no reason, just simply based on the dynamic interaction of all those parts. And this little video that I have here showing these cars flowing smoothly around this circle is a good illustration of that, because this was an experiment done in Japan where they just had like 20 cars drive around in a circle, and they give them very simple instruction, like just try and drive at a steady, 25 miles an hour. Should be fairly simple. And sometimes you get a little bit closer, oops, you speed up a little too much, okay, you slow down, but no problem. Except that after just a few minutes, the whole smooth pattern of activity started to break down. And you see we developed this traffic jam out of nothing, right? It's just cars driving along, trying to drive at the same speed, and we developed this traffic jam starts to form just because one car goes a little too fast and the other has to slam on his brakes, the car behind him slams on his brakes a little too much, and it's that dynamic interaction that creates this very stable pattern that now they are stuck in. Okay? And you could say, well, why doesn't that van just drive a little bit faster? Well, because the car in front of him is driving slow. And it's not any one individual's problem. It's the interaction of the whole system. And that's what's going on in the brain. It's not that, oh, you just need a little bit more serotonin or a little less of this or a little more activity here. It's the complex dynamic interaction of all those parts that keeps you stuck in depression. And the real problem with depression is the brain tends to think and act in ways that keep it depressed. And so, so why is that? Why are some people have a propensity to develop depression? Why is, the 405 going over the Sepulveda Pass such a terrible place to develop traffic? Yes?
More social stressors, genetics, just situational things.
Oh yes, no, there's excellent things I'm going to talk about in a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Rhetorical question. But the answer, comparing it to the 405, is there are certain parts of the 405, just based on how they are designed, that they lead to a higher propensity of traffic. That doesn't mean you couldn't have traffic other places. It's just those parts are much more likely to develop traffic jams. And it's the same with people. Just that individual, based on the tuning of their particular circuits, they're more likely to get stuck in depression. There's nothing wrong with their brain, just there's nothing, why do tornadoes happen in Oklahoma and not in LA? There's the same weather dynamics that control both areas. There's nothing wrong with Oklahoma. It's just based on the lay of the land, wherever, it increases the likelihood of those patterns forming. And so the things that structure those and influence the development of those brain circuits are primarily these three things: genetics, right? You have certain genes that develop that influence your brain development and change the tuning of a whole bunch of different neural circuits. For example, there's one gene that controls part of the serotonin transporter molecule, which we know is a target for most antidepressant medications. That one gene actually can influence the communication between two key areas in the brain, the anterior cingulate and the amygdala, which we'll talk about more. But just individual genes, they're not completely changing everything, but they're changing the dynamics. They may be turning up the volume on that speaker of that circuit just a little bit. Your early experiences, particularly your childhood experiences, how your parents treated you, even your experiences in utero, stressors that you experience change and shape your brain development, not just structurally, but also chemically, and how your brain is going to respond. And then, the other third big thing is your current life circumstances. What are the stressors that are going on in your life, the coping strategies that you've developed, the habits that you have, your social interactions, and all three of those things are sort of shaping the brain circuits that influence depression. So to get a little bit technical for a moment, because we're just going to, we're going to want to talk about the neuroscience. Depression is a dysfunction in frontal limbic communication. Okay, so that can sometimes be overwhelming, but it's actually the parallel to what I said earlier when I said depression is a problem with how the thinking and the feeling parts of the brain communicate. Well, the frontal in this comes from prefrontal cortex, and that's sort of more the thinking part of the brain. And limbic here comes from the limbic system, which is a set of structures that are much more closely tied to emotion. Do you have a question, or? Yeah, feel free. If you have any questions, you can feel free to interrupt. I know I sort of said in the introduction to the talk that we'd, make sure we learned about the main structures and circuits associated with depression, and, the chemicals that are involved in depression, and then how we can modulate, activity and the chemistry there to help people overcome depression. So I'm just going to sort of lay out the basic neuroscience. So this part shaded right here, which you guys can't really see, but is the front part of the brain. That's why it's called the prefrontal cortex. And humans have more prefrontal cortex than any other animal. And this is really the thinking, planning, decision-making, strategizing, worrying part of the brain. And it's really the sort of front third of your brain. And deeper down, can you see that? Oh, yes, right now, is the limbic system, which is a set of structures that all mammals have. It's evolutionarily much more ancient, started showing up in brains like 60 million years ago. And it's, it's really responsible for a lot of your basic drives and emotions and moods. And, these are supposed to communicate normally on an everyday basis, but sometimes, they just don't quite regulate each other properly. In depression, those are the two main parts of the brain that are responsible for getting stuck in this pattern of activity. But there's also a couple connected areas, and we can sort of list them all out. It can sort of be overwhelming. Sometimes you're not as familiar with them. The prefrontal cortex we sort of break up into a few different parts. The limbic system has some regions that you might be familiar with: the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cingulate cortex, or the anterior cingulate. I'll talk a little bit more about these roles, but I just wanted to, spit them out there. And then, some connected areas that are closely connected to these two that are important in depression are the striatum, which is particularly important in addiction, and the insula, which is really related to bodily and physical discomfort. So the prefrontal cortex is this big, the whole front third surface of the brain. A lot of times when people talk about it, they sort of, oh yeah, the prefrontal cortex is involved in this, involved in that. It's pretty much involved in everything that you do as a human being. And it's divided into a lot of different parts. I sort of created this little axis to sort of show you how it can be divided up. But the top half is more cognitive, and the bottom half is more emotional. You're not going to have to remember all these little details, but I think it's sometimes good to just understand what those details are. Now you might think this is strange because I just said, well, the prefrontal cortex is the thinking part of the brain, right? So why is part of it emotional, part of it cognitive? Well, the top half is more thinking about thinking, and the bottom half is more thinking about feeling. So those deep emotions that you feel when you experience them, that's not coming from the prefrontal cortex, that's coming from the limbic system. But your ability to regulate your emotions, that's much more ventral, or the lower part of the prefrontal cortex, much more, meeting a cute girl at a bar and trying to remember her phone number. That's in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, working memory, planning, strategizing, those are more cognitive things in the dorsal part. The medial part of the prefrontal cortex towards the midline, also, it sort of looks small in this picture, but it actually, since the brain is two halves, it sort of plunges down into the middle here. The middle is more self-focused. It's thinking about yourself, whereas the lateral part is more thinking about the outside world, which creates sort of a, 4 distinct regions of the prefrontal cortex, parts that are focused on your emotional self, parts that are focused on the emotions of other people and predicting, social interactions, parts that are thinking about planning for the outside world, and such and such. And all of these regions, have connections to all of each other, and sometimes, when we get stuck in worry loops, for example, we're just, we're thinking about, okay, what could I could do this, but then how would I feel about it? Then how would that make other people feel? And then how would I feel about this? And how would they feel? And like, all of that communication is happening within the prefrontal cortex. So the other part, the major part, is the limbic system. One of the major parts of the limbic system is the amygdala. Okay, you may have heard of the amygdala. It's like often called the fear center of the brain, but really all your emotions activate the amygdala. Another closely connected region is the hypothalamus. And actually the limbic system is really all of the structures in the brain that are closely connected to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a very basic, deep part of the brain that's responsible for the fight or flight response. The hypothalamic pituitary axis, the HPA axis, which you may be familiar with, the stress response. That's really what's going on in the hypothalamus, and all of the limbic system structures are closely connected to that. The hippocampus is responsible for memory and context, sort of understanding your context and your relationship to the world. And the anterior cingulate is an important structure because not only is it connected closely with the limbic system, but all those prefrontal areas that I talked about all have connections to the anterior cingulate as well. So the anterior cingulate is really the intersection of emotion and thinking, and it plays a lot of roles in attention as well. The connected areas and why they're particularly important in addiction, one of those is the striatum, which is even more ancient part of the brain than the limbic system. Even reptiles have a striatum, so it's hundreds of millions of years old. And this is where dopamine particularly comes into play. Now, there's two particular parts of the striatum, the dorsal part and the ventral part, which is the lower part. But both are concerned with how we create our actions. But the dorsal part of the striatum is responsible for sort of just basic habits. It chooses our actions based simply on, well, I did that before. And so it is trying to choose our actions based on what we did before. The ventral striatum, or the nucleus accumbens, as I call it here, you might be familiar with that. That's what we often think of as the pleasure center of the brain. That chooses our actions, tries to drive our actions based on what's most immediately pleasurable, right? Should I continue sitting here, or should I keep talking? Oh, there's a cupcake over there. Okay, so the nucleus accumbens is like cupcake, but how our actions get chosen is this constant dynamic communication between all of these brain regions that I talked about. The prefrontal cortex is the only part that's concerned about the future, right? That's the part that of the brain that's like thinking about the future. How is this going to affect me? How does this relate to my values? And what do I want to have happen? So it's trying to choose our actions based on some abstract future. The dorsal striatum is voting for, like, well, we did this thing before, and let's just do that again. It doesn't really care whether it worked or not. It just cares about repetition. And the nucleus accumbens is like, oh, cupcake, or cocaine, or alcohol. And depending on how those are communicating, that's how you get stuck in certain habits. The insula is an interesting part because this is a really important part in the pain and discomfort circuit in the brain. And it is also part of the cortex, which is the surface of the brain, but again, there's a lot of folds and everything in the brain, so it's sort of hidden deep down inside there. Whenever you feel physical discomfort, there's activity in the insula. And the thing about pain, people don't realize, we often think of pain as like, oh, I have a pain neuron here that gets stimulated because I cut myself. That travels up into my brain, goes into the insula, signals, oh, there's something painful and I feel pain. But in fact, you don't have to have any painful stimulus in your body. If the pain circuits in the brain are activated, you're going to feel bodily pain and discomfort even though there's nothing wrong. And that's why, there's this huge intersection between pain disorders and drug addiction and depression and sleep disorders, because all of these things are relying sort of on the same circuits. So there's a lot of overlap. Now to just go briefly, so we're talking a lot about brain structures. Well, brain structures communicate through chemicals, through neurotransmitters. The way that the neuroscience of it works is you have all these little cells that are sitting, in each of those regions, and those little neurons have long wires or axons that stretch out to other parts of the brain. And they send a little electrical pulse down there, and when that little electrical pulse reaches the end, it squirts out a little bit of chemical neurotransmitter. And so that is how the brain communicates. Now that little squirt of neurotransmitter, it's not so much like telling the next neuron, hey, you should fire. It's more like a vote, okay? Like, we vote for the president, and if enough people vote one way, then, we elect this president. And so as a neuron, if I'm sitting in the, amygdala, I'm trying to figure out, should I fire and create some anxiety or not? Well, I'm getting inputs from a whole bunch of different things, and everyone's like, yes, vote, vote, vote. Okay, fine, I'll start freaking out now. The reason why that's important to understand is, this is a very complex system, but just like the presidential election, a few key changes can have a big effect. If you can just, there's a big country, but if you can just influence the voting, reach a few voters in a few key swing states, you can change the whole outcome and direction of the country, okay? And so that's sort of what we're thinking about when we're talking about the neuroscience of depression. There are these few key regions here, and so we don't need to change everything about the brain. If we can just change the activity of a few key regions or a few key neurotransmitters, then we can sort of change the direction and the course of depression. Yeah, so the three main ones in depression are serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You've probably heard of them. Most antidepressant medications target one or several of these. Serotonin is particularly important in willpower, motivation, and mood. The norepinephrine enhances thinking and focus and helps you deal with stress. And dopamine, as I mentioned before, sort of increases enjoyment and gives you pleasure, and it's necessary for changing bad habits, but also is the reason why you get stuck in bad habits. And there's a bunch of other related chemicals. I mean, the brain is full of chemicals, and these ones are also related to depression. Oxytocin, that has to do with our social interactions, and a lot of these neurotransmitters modulate the other ones. So that's why everything is so connected. Like, oxytocin can modulate dopamine, and that's one of the reasons why we find social interactions rewarding. But if you don't have enough oxytocin, then you're not going to find those social interactions as rewarding, and then you're going to stop doing them, and then you're going to feel isolated, and then you start this downward spiral. Melatonin is a neurotransmitter that helps us regulate our sleep patterns. Endorphins help diminish pain. Endocannabinoids is one you might not be familiar with, but endorphins, the name endorphins comes from endogenous morphine. It's the morphine that your brain makes itself. Endocannabinoids, you might recognize part of that root as cannabis, and that's the cannabinoids that your brain makes itself. And so you can imagine those has effects of increased feelings of peacefulness and well-being, sometimes stimulating appetite. And then GABA is, it's a long acronym, but that is what benzodiazepines target, and that helps increase relaxation and reduces anxiety. So you have all these brain regions interacting, and they're all using all these different neurochemicals to interact with each other. And in the last, really 5 or 10 years, it's led to this new understanding of just how the brain works to regulate mood and actions and habits and activity. And it's really started to help us understand what's going on in the brain in depression. And we don't have a fully unified theory of understanding what depression is yet, but we, as I've showed you already, we do know a lot of the pieces, and we do know how to change the activity or chemistry of some of those pieces. So I'm just going to give you a couple snapshots of that. There's a study they did in Wisconsin. They took, imagine a woman, she goes into the lab, she's sitting there filling out paperwork with her husband. The scientist is calmly attaching electrodes to her ankle, and then he leads her into the MRI room, where they put her inside an MRI, and it's set up such that she has this screen, this computer screen that she can see, that every once in a while tells her, oh, you're about to get an electric shock. It's a small electric shock, but still uncomfortable, enough to activate the insula. And the scientists aren't so much interested in the brain's response to being shocked. They're interested in how her brain is responding to the anticipation of being shocked, because it's we have way more anticipation of negative events than we actually have negative events in our lives. There's a great, I should remember this quote, but there's this very famous essayist, Michel de Montaigne, who was this rich guy in the 1600s who locked himself in a tower to just write essays once he got enough money. And he said, paraphrasing, basically that I've suffered so many misfortunes in my life, most of which never happened. And because that is one of the things that especially makes us humans is our prefrontal cortex and its ability to imagine all of these terrible scenarios. And one of the things that people get so upset with themselves about is oh my God, why am I thinking about all these negative things all the time? It's well, that part of your brain is just doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, which is designed to keep you safe. It's anticipating all the things that could go wrong and trying to figure out how to avoid them. And just because your limbic system is a little bit too active, you get stuck in that loop, but it's not like anything is wrong with your brain. As I said before, there's nothing that you can test about someone that would tell them whether they have depression or not. But anyway, getting back to the study, so they looked at what happened to her brain when she's anticipating all those negative events, and a predictable set of brain regions lights up, particularly in worrying circuits in the prefrontal areas and in discomfort in the insula, because even the anticipation of that discomfort sort of leads to discomfort. But then the scientists repeat the study. They'd only done this on married women, and they put the woman in the same MRI machine, got the same shocks, but now her husband was just sitting there holding her hand. Okay? And the brain's response to anticipation of electric shocks has now decreased. Activity in this dorsolateral prefrontal regions, which is sort of where the worrying is going on, has gone down. Activity in the Anterior Cingulate, which is sort of the intersection of emotion and thinking and attention, has decreased. So the physical act of touch has changed her brain's response to these negative events. And in fact, they did a further analysis showed the stronger the marriage was, the stronger the effect. They asked both the husband and the wife a bunch of questions like, how strong do you think the marriage was? It was only, by the way, related to how strong the wife thought the marriage was. It's her brain that's being scanned, obviously. But what's also interesting is even if they didn't do it with the husband, they just had a random researcher sit there and hold her hand, it still had a lot of the same effects. So just having someone be supportive can be helpful, but obviously someone who you're close to can be even more helpful. In another study done on exercise in Japan, researchers had participants ride on stationary bikes. Scientists really love stationary bikes because it's easy to study. And they had them with this crazy little helmet that had all these light sensors that were infrared light sensors that could detect subtle changes in blood flow in the brain. Happy to answer any questions about it, but we don't need to get into all the technical details. But they found that just like 15 minutes of exercise was enough to increase blood flow in these prefrontal regions of the brain that are responsible for emotional control and impulse inhibition. Inhibiting impulses. Whereas other regions of the brain, if you look at, didn't see that same increase. So there's something about exercise that's helpful. They also found that just this 15 minutes of exercise was enough to increase the availability of serotonin, which is one of the neurotransmitters used largely by the prefrontal cortex to help us plan for the future and control our mood and impulses.
Sorry, did they have to reach a certain intensity level of exercise?
So in this particular study, they were just at a medium level of exercise for 15 minutes. There have been a lot of different studies that have looked at, do you need to have intense exercise or is any exercise better? And I'll talk about some exercise more later, but what we do know is that moving, because when I say exercise, but really just mean moving. Moving and doing stuff is better than not moving. So the reason why I'm hesitant to answer that question is, one, it's very complicated. People don't really know the answer. But if you're dealing with someone with depression and you're like, okay, we have to exercise 3 times a week at high intensity to get this effect, they're like, well, I'm not gonna do it. Okay, well then stop sitting on the couch. Just walk from your couch to the sidewalk and back. If you get to the sidewalk and you feel like walking around the block, go ahead and do that. That's better than doing nothing. And so it appears with serotonin, at least, that any sort of exercise can give you that benefit, particularly if it's voluntary exercise. I'll talk about that more in a moment. For norepinephrine, it suggests, they weren't looking at norepinephrine in that particular study, but to get benefits from norepinephrine, it seems that intense exercise is particularly good at boosting that. But the idea is okay, yeah, if you can manage intense exercise, great, you'll get more benefits. But even sometimes just, nice, calm exercise has other benefits. So, in this third study, it was done in a hospital in Pittsburgh, I think, somewhere in Pennsylvania. And it was in the surgery ward where they're having people recover from spinal surgery. Okay, it's sort of a uncomfortable place to be in. And they measured the amount of sunlight in the recovery rooms, because it turned out one side of the hospital had these bright sunny rooms, the other side faced another building, and they were very dark. And so I had this theory that somehow the amount of sunlight would help. And it turned out that the patients on the dim side of the hallway needed about, just to maintain their level of comfort, needed about 4 milligrams of morphine per hour, whereas the patients on the bright side only needed 3 milligrams of morphine per hour. So that simply being on the bright side of the hospital was equivalent to getting an extra milligram of morphine per, yeah, open that window. This might seem kind of crazy, but we know a lot about how sunlight, both with interactions with your skin and interactions with your eyes, can have many positive effects with serotonin and with regulation of the sleep and circadian systems.
That was in hospital, right?
Yeah, so this is just in recovery in recovering from the hospital. But sunlight plays an important aspect in all our lives. Like, for example, if you're having trouble sleeping, well, one of the best things you can do is probably like, well, make sure you go out in the middle of the day and get bright sunlight, because that resets your brain's circadian clock and then enhance the release of melatonin later on when you're trying to fall asleep. Similarly, once the sun goes down, if you got all the lights on in your apartment and you're staring at bright lights, that's affecting your brain and it's going to make it harder to go to sleep. Now, we often compare ourselves to other people, like, oh, well, my roommate has no problem falling asleep. He leaves lights on. Okay, well, everyone's brains are different. And for you, you might be more sensitive. Your circadian system might be more sensitive to light levels. So you might have to do something different. And that's one of the things that's important to recognize about the neuroscience of depression, is that like everyone's brain is different. There are very few things that work for everyone in all ways. We know this about antidepressant medications. Some people, they have severe depression, and they can just take a pill once a day, and within a few weeks they're totally fine. They weren't making it up. They were severely depressed. They have depression, but just that little drop of boosting serotonin is enough for them. For other people, I had a friend who would, if she didn't go running every day, she would just feel awful and terrible. She didn't realize this about herself. Some days she would feel awful and terrible, and other days she wouldn't. And I was like, well, just because you love running, you need to go running. And if she went running every day, she would be fine. For most people, it's some combination of a bunch of factors. Like if you have depression, yes, the antidepressant medication can help a little bit. Maybe try exercising or try regulating your sleep patterns. Actually, before I get too far into that, I'll just talk about this in general. And this is what I call the upward spiral, okay? Which is simply the notion that positive life changes cause these positive brain changes in all these neurochemicals and regions that we've just listed. But those positive brain changes then make further positive life changes easier and more accessible, okay? Well, let me just show you this. I think it really starts with understanding, okay? Understanding yourself, understanding the neuroscience behind it, just like, how your brain works, how it's, different from other people, what are your problems, what are the things that help you. Exercise is a huge one. So these are all, I'd say, like, the 9, I think, easiest things, or, the best things, the ways that we know of that can contribute to altering brain activity and chemistry in a positive way. Decision making, making decisions, setting goals, short-term goals, long-term goals, those have dramatic effects on how the brain perceives the world and how the prefrontal cortex organizes your actions. Changing sleep patterns, improving what we call sleep hygiene, which can lead to improved sleep. Poor sleep, they did a long study on insomnia, because we know that insomnia, people with depression have generally bad sleep, okay? But it turns out that if you follow people who just have insomnia, they don't have depression, they have insomnia, they have just poor dysregulated sleep. If you follow them, they are much more likely to develop depression. So that's why almost all these aspects of depression are this sort of loop spiral, downward spiral effect, where if you have bad sleep, you're more likely to develop depression. But if you're depressed, you're more likely to have bad sleep. Okay? So you can, the downward spiral can sort of start at any part of it, but so too can the upward spiral. If you just interact with any one of these items and make an intervention there, you can change the course of that illness. It might not, making one change might not be enough, but you never know what's that small change that's going to have that effect. changing your habits, both, habits are a very complex thing. There's coping habits, there's, just your day-to-day habits, going to work, or, your social habits, your interactions. Biofeedback, that's a sort of a complex sounding term, but it can be very simple in practice. And a lot of times that just means taking a deep breath. What happens there is you have all of these neurons that are coming from all over your body that are going up into the brain, that are telling you, sensing information from the body. We like to think that our emotions are a one-way street, that, I feel a certain way, I feel tense, and therefore my muscles tense up. Or I'm feeling scared, and therefore I'm breathing faster. But it's actually, our emotions are actually a two-way street, mediated by this, particularly by this one nerve, the vagus nerve, that one of its projections is the insula in the brain, which is responsible for discomfort. And so it's not just, I feel anxious, therefore I'm breathing fast. It's also your brain's, you're breathing fast, I must be feeling anxious. And so you can break that biofeedback by just taking a deep breath and letting out slowly. Or maybe you have all this muscle tension. Okay, well then stretch your muscles or relax your muscles. Yoga is a huge part of biofeedback because it incorporates a lot of these things. It incorporates stretching and changes in breathing. But, it also incorporates understanding and exercise and habits. And so there are a lot of interventions you can make that accomplish multiple aspects of this. Gratitude, that's a big one because it actually improves sleep, it improves positive emotions. They did a study where they had students just write, keep a gratitude journal just of things they're grateful for before they went to sleep, and their sleep improved. And we know that, improving sleep has all these other benefits, reducing pain, improving concentration, all that stuff. So that's why, one change causes positive brain changes, and those further positive brain changes cause more positive changes. Social interactions, just talking with people, being around people, physically touching people, getting a massage, getting a hug. Those in particular we know increase oxytocin. And the last little bit I have here is professional help. A lot of times when people talk to me and I have listed out all these different things you can do to help yourself or to suggest to people with depression, they say, so you don't think medication, you don't think people need medication? I'm like, no. Medication is a very important part of treating depression. It's just that's the thing. If you're a person who has depression, you have to go to someone and get medication. You can do all these other things on your own. As a therapist or someone treating depression, then yes, if they feel like they need an antidepressant, then give it to them. And also suggest that they take all these other steps, or at least one or two other steps, because we know, antidepressant medications, the rule of thumb is sort of for a third of people, it'll just work like a charm and they'll get completely better. Another third of people, they'll definitely help a lot, they'll get much better, but not all the way better. And another third of people, it won't really have an effect. So, for 2/3 of the people, it's probably going to be take an antidepressant medication and something else. And if you're just an individual who has depression, while you're waiting to go see the doctor, maybe go for a walk, or maybe call up a friend or your mom and talk to her. So as I just pointed out, these arrows just sort of illustrate, once you maybe it starts with understanding, and then you exercise actually improves the quality of sleep. If you keep doing it, that creates a habit. Once, the first time you do an action, it's controlled by the prefrontal cortex because it has to be an intentional, willful action. You have to think about it. It requires energy. The more you do it, that action now gets encoded in the dorsal striatum, okay? And now you no longer have to think about doing it. Has anyone here tried to start flossing on a regular basis? That's it. Like, I had a lot of cavities growing up, and the dentist like, you should try flossing. I know I should try flossing. And then one time I was like, screw, okay, I'm gonna try it. And it's very hard. The comedian Mitch Hedberg, who unfortunately had a great joke, he's like, I don't know how hard it is to quit smoking, but I imagine it's about as difficult as it is to start flossing.
Worse.
What?
It's worse.
Yeah. But because like you have to, you have your whole routine, and then you have to remind yourself, oh yeah, it seems like such a chore to like go, the first time you do, you gotta go buy some dental floss, and it's like such a chore. But then after you do it for like, 2 weeks, a month, then it just seems to be a natural part of your routine. It doesn't require conscious intervention. And that's when the action is being transferred from the prefrontal cortex to the striatum. Now, one of the biggest problems with addiction is when addiction starts out, it started out by pleasure, by the ventral striatum, by the nucleus accumbens that's releasing dopamine. Okay, I'm gonna, just have this can of beer. It's gonna it makes me feel better. It makes me feel excited. It sort of calms me down, and that releases some dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and so that's what starts the addiction. It's pleasurable. The problem is that as time goes on, that pleasure sort of diminishes, and that action simply gets encoded in the dorsal striatum, which is responsible not doing things for pleasure, not doing things for our best interest, but simply doing them because we've done them before. And that's where people fall into a problem, is you can't stop it because it's being driven by this unconscious loop. You feel this compulsion to do this thing. You're not necessarily even deriving any pleasure from it, but that's how actions get encoded in the striatum. And so the good news about that is if you can, sort of will yourself or help someone into some positive habits and then help encode those positive habits and repeat them, well then you can start the reverse trend. You can start relying on those positive habits without always needing that conscious intervention. Sleep habits are another one. Simple turning off the TV before you get into bed. And sleep can improve biofeedback because it reduces pain. There's interactions. It improves positive mood, so you have more to be grateful for. All of these things interact with each other as social and professional. Like there's evidence that for people who take antidepressant medications, if you had more social support before you start taking antidepressant medications, the antidepressant medications work better. So all of these things, all of these things interact. So you might as well try, all of them.
It's like these spider webs all around.
Right, yes. Exactly. We'll talk a little bit more about a few key interventions. We just take some questions. So exercise. Exercise, I think, is one of the easiest, or at least most straightforward thing to do to combat depression and anxiety and addiction and pain disorders. Because as I said before, it really just means moving instead of not moving. One, there's a lot of research out that highlights the problems with sitting. So you guys, after this, you shouldn't sit for too long. But like, the tagline is like, sitting is the new smoking. Like, if you just sit and are stationary most of the time, like, yeah, it's good to go get some exercise, but it would probably be better to just like, make sure you move around throughout the day. That's like, these pedometers are great. Like, you don't have to go to the gym, every day for half an hour and do intense exercise. Like, just take the stairs instead of the elevator. Don't spend 5 minutes looking for the closest parking spot. Just take the first parking spot you see and then walk 200 feet to the office. Simple things like that can have a big effect. Exercise reduces stress hormones like cortisol, which is part of that HPA axis, the activation of the stress response. Exercise reduces that. It can actually start growth of new neurons in the hippocampus, which, coincidentally, is something that antidepressant medications can also do. So exercise has a lot of similarities and effects to what antidepressants do. It also increases the availability of a lot of neurotransmitter systems, serotonin, norepinephrine. Exercise, importantly, also helps regulate sleep. And so if you exercise, you get better sleep, which gives you more energy to exercise more. One of the interesting aspects that I sort of mentioned before is this notion of the difference between voluntary versus forced exercise. Voluntary exercise has a lot more of the neurochemical benefits than forced exercise. Okay, so if you're just like, someone doesn't want to exercise, you drag them on a run, they might get some benefit, but they would get more of a benefit if you convince them, like, hey, why don't you come with a run? Why don't you come with me on a run? And then they made the active choice to go do the exercise. It creates a lot more physiological benefit, and that sort of makes sense if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, because the difference between voluntary versus forced exercise is the difference between running because you are hunting something and running because it's hunting you. And that's why there's a whole loop of the upward spiral about decision making, because the decisions that you make change how your brain perceives what's happening to you. So the same thing could be happening. You could be running on a treadmill, but it could be perceived as stressful, or it could be perceived as helpful. And so that's why I think, understanding is really one of the best ways to start the whole thing off. The biofeedback, that was another big one. This is another easy one to do. Facial expression plays a big role. Everyone, why don't you just smile for a second? So a lot of times we think smiling, okay, well, I only smile if I'm happy, but it turns out that if you smile, you're more likely to feel positive emotions. And smiling is really just nothing more than just flexing a certain, couple muscles of the face. If you flex certain muscles of the face, you feel better, so you might as well do that. It's not about necessarily masking your emotions. If you're feeling sad, it's okay to be sad, but a lot of times we're not even aware that we're making this tense motion, particularly this muscle up here. It's called the corrugator supercilii, because it corrugates your forehead. And even more so than smiling, this leads to negative emotions. And when we're feeling tense or something's difficult, we just naturally furrow our brow. If you're squinting a lot outside, you squint, to keep the sun out of your eyes. Well, sometimes putting sunglasses on can make you feel calmer, not just because you look cooler, but because you're not doing this with your face, and that's why you feel calmer. Botox. One of the side effects of Botox, sometimes women or people go get sorry, LA, everyone goes get Botox. They found they get Botox injections to reduce wrinkles in their forehead, and they found that it can actually reduce depressive symptoms because you're not able to make this anxious face anymore, and so your feelings of anxiety and worry sort of decrease. Now, there are obviously other side effects. You can't be as surprised or happy as much also. But there is this whole impact of facial expression. Are you clenching your jaw? Okay, maybe just relax your jaw. Posture has a big effect. People with depression tend to have a slumped and withdrawn posture. And there's a lot of evidence that if you bring your shoulders back, open up your chest, that can have increases in testosterone. There's been a lot of studies on job interviews. It's not just how it makes you feel, because there's some biofeedback of that, but there's also a social feedback. If you're interacting with someone who has a withdrawn posture, you're going to treat them a certain way. So if you have a more confident, open posture, you're probably gonna have a more positive interaction with the other person. And so that's something, okay, I don't need to think about trying to make you like me or whatever. Okay, all I have to do is like stand up straight, and then the rest of the work will do itself. Changing your breathing rate. Sometimes when you're feeling really lethargic, and after lunch right now, everyone can try this. You can try breathing fast right now. That'll actually give you more energy. Because it's like, oh, I'm breathing fast. I must be about to run from something. You can try it.
If you can't get to Starbucks, you recommend
Yeah. If you get if you're feeling too lethargic, try, jumping up now, breathing fast, do some shadow boxing. It actually increases your energy level. There's a study, I coach ultimate frisbee, I tell the girls on my team to do that. There's one study that had students like just walk versus skip. And like if you skip, there's a lot of reasons why, but part of it is the biofeedback. It was like, okay, I'm doing a more energetic motion, therefore I should, utilize more energy. Because our feeling of energy, your feeling of fatigue, is not actually related to how much energy you have. Because your brain has this, always has this energy in reserves. Imagine if your car, the gas light comes on at the same time, when you have 2 gallons left. But in the brain, that's your feeling of fatigue, right? Like the gas light comes on, you're like, oh God, I better stop, I better need to find some energy soon. Except in the brain, it's very variable. Okay, if you're having a good time, if you're happy, then it's gonna let that gas tank, it's not gonna come on. It's not gonna come on much later. But if you're in a bad mood, you got a terrible night's sleep, you're having problems at work, you're stressed out, the gas tank light's gonna come on when you still got half a tank left. And so you don't always need to get more energy. Sometimes you just need to convince your brain, like, oh look, buddy, we still got, you and I both know that we still have more energy in the tank. And so sometimes like skipping or breathing fast, that changes that set point. Muscle tension, we don't oftentimes realize how much tension we're carrying around in our bodies. Sometimes flexing and then relaxing can help, but that's why yoga is so powerful, because actually stretching and reducing the tension in our muscles makes you feel physically calmer. Social interaction is an important one, and it's not always as easy to do, particularly for people with addiction problems, because one of the difficulties with social interaction, and probably one of the reasons why a lot of people end up becoming addicts, is that we feel social exclusion in the same way that we feel physical pain. Okay? There's a very simple study done on this where they put someone in an MRI machine to look at their brain activity, and they played this little game where they could see themselves on the computer screen, like 2 other little players, and they were just supposed to throw a ball back and forth. It's called cyberball. And the researchers told the subject, look, okay, you're in an MRI scanner, and we got 2 other people in MRI scanners, and you guys are just going to be throwing the ball back and forth to each other, and we're going to measure everyone's brain activity. Except the subject was the only person in the scanner. The other 2 people are just the computer. And after a couple minutes of throwing the ball back and forth, the other 2 players just started throwing it back and forth to each other. And you're like, hey, I'm ready, I'm right here. And they just ignore you and just throw the ball back and forth to each other. And that's just that simple little thing in normal, healthy people is enough to elicit sort of a feeling of social exclusion that activates the same brain regions as physical pain. And so, in our social circuitry, some people are just more sensitive to social rejection, some people are less sensitive, and that's just how it is. And oftentimes when we are sensitive to social rejection, then we don't connect with other people, and then we miss out on all the benefits of connecting with other people. One of those is that, physical touch with other people. Physical touch releases neurotransmitter oxytocin, which reduces anxiety increases feelings of calm and peacefulness. In fact, the oxytocin targets there's receptors for oxytocin in the hypothalamus, which is the fight or flight center of the brain. That's one of the reasons why it has that stress-reducing calmness. And as I said, I think before, oxytocin actually can modulate dopamine to, so that those social interactions become more rewarding the more we do them. So like if you avoid social interactions, then they might become scary, but the more you do them, the more rewarding they become, particularly as we get closer to people. And actually, there's studies shown that if you increase oxytocin, then the rewarding aspects of drugs of abuse goes down. I think there's a study in rats where they give them injections of oxytocin, and then you give them access to cocaine, and it's not just that they use less cocaine, but they use less cocaine because the brain's response in the nucleus accumbens, it actually releases less dopamine to that cocaine because it's getting what it needs from somewhere else, from that social interactions, the release of oxytocin. So it's not always easy to help people try and connect with others, but it's so important because that's how we evolved as humans to work in groups and be close with each other. The last little bit I'll talk about right now is the importance of sleep. Sleep, as I said before, reduces pain. One of the reasons why people get hooked on opioids in the first place is because they have pain. They weren't, it didn't start from nothing. They had pain, the opioids helped, and then it got ingrained in the striatum. They got hooked on it. But improving sleep helps reduce pain. It improves focus. It has a lot of, it increases energy, has a lot of beneficial effects. Sunlight, as I mentioned before, sunlight might reduce pain directly, but one of the ways that sunlight might help is that sunlight helps improve your quality of sleep. If you are, we're in an office right now, it seems like it's bright, but in fact, that's just because your eyes are so good at adjusting to dark levels. Outside, they're literally 10,000 times brighter than inside here. You can go outside with you can measure the number of photons, and in a dimly lit office, that level hitting your eye is about 1,000, and in I guess around 500 or whatever, and outside it's like 1 million. We sort of habituate to it, but getting outside in the sunlight while the sun is shining is very helpful because the photoreceptors in your eyes help regulate your circadian rhythms. It's also good for the skin because we get vitamin D by absorbing sun through the skin. People think, I can just take a vitamin D tablet, but we don't use it. Our bodies don't utilize it in the same way. And getting that sunlight absorbed through the skin helps, helps with the synthesis of serotonin, helps change the serotonin transporter molecule, and all that good stuff. There are a whole bunch of aspects of sleep hygiene, which are the things that we do that lead up to sleep that improve the quality of sleep. Turning off lights before you go to sleep. Don't use your iPad or do work in bed. It's okay to have sex in bed because it's a positive, fun thing, but you shouldn't try and do don't work in bed and then just turn off the light and expect to fall asleep. Your brain needs to wind down. Just having a routine, a habit of I go through these, before I take a shower, and then I brush my teeth, and then I go to bed. And just a series of routines that helps your brain wind down before you just plop into bed. That helps you improve your quality of sleep. So, all of these things that I showed before come together to create the upward spiral and reverse the course of depression. So thank you so much. I'm happy to accept your applause, sure. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have, or I'm not sure how much time we have 9 or 10 minutes ago. But if anyone has any questions,
What was the, I guess that person, which of the following brain regions is most responsible for long-term planning?
oh, that's the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the front third, it's basically the front third surface of your brain. It's that the whole thing, okay, yeah, well, so I can show you so the prefrontal cortex is this whole front third of the brain. It's divided into several different parts that, focus more on the emotional aspect or the cognitive aspect. But the prefrontal cortex overall sort of connects our current actions to future rewards. So it helps us project ourselves in the future. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
I wonder how much technology, what your thoughts are about what technology is doing towards the upward spiral or downward spiral.
Mm-hmm. You mean,
Any study?
what sort of technology?
Well,
Like, do you mean technology for treating depression, or? Oh,
No,
yeah.
what they're finding, what your studies are finding about how it's affecting people's social interactions. Are studies being done on
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, so it turns out that texting with people is not quite as good as interacting with them, hearing their voice. I think there was a study done, on girls like, talking with their mothers versus, texting with their mothers. They released more oxytocin when they were talking. Sometimes it can be useful to like, if you're feeling worried about a test and your friend texts you, hey, good luck. They have shown studies with people doing MRI studies, some with shocks, where if the researchers just send them little messages like, hey, hang in there, whatever, like, those can be helpful. But if your primary means of communication is texting, then you're missing out on a whole lot of beneficial interactions from actual face-to-face contact or actually hearing someone's voice. And part of the problem with that is like, part of the reason we do text is like it's safer, because we just sort of like communicate and communicate out, and it's there's a great TED talk about this, about how like we're sort of more broadcasting, and we don't have to risk the actually social rejection, which is scary, but then it tends to isolate us. So we sort of, it's very important to sort of help reduce, to actually connect with people to help reduce your fears of social rejection. So that is one of the problems of those technologies. Yeah.
Are there any gender differences in the brain that impact depression?
Yes. So women tend to be more emotional than men, for example. So they're emotional. Like you can view this in like a lot of times when people say it, they say it in a judgmental way, like women are so emotional they can't control their emotions. But you can say it negatively the other way, like men are so emotionally stunted they can't even tell when their friend is upset. But just in general, women tend to have stronger, more reactive emotional circuitry. And so like that is one of the reasons I think why women tend to get stuck. Women's brains tend to get stuck in depression more easily. The good news is that women tend to respond better to antidepressant medications than men do. So women have like their rates of depression are about 2 to 3 times as high, but they're twice as likely to respond to medications. So that's one aspect of it. Socially, I was hearing about an interesting study that men benefit more from marriage emotionally than women do, because women have tend to have lots of people who they can have close personal conversations with, reach those deep connections. But men, whether it's evolutionary or just our modern day conception of what's masculine or not, find it harder to reach those deep connections with other people, and so they don't benefit from it. yes.
There's a
Question.
book called The Confidence Code that outlines the differences between men and women and talks about how women evolved the tendon befriend, which is opposite to men's fight or flight. That when
Mhm.
fight or flight kicks in, a man's response when cortisol goes up to fight or flight,
Mhm.
and women tend or befriend. They connect and discuss the feelings, and it allows them to diffuse the anxiety that's being caused.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of, the entire book is how women are different in terms of confidence around the biochemistry.
Right, yeah, and a lot of it is there are certain innate differences that come from, the genetics. But what happens is those slight innate differences tend to get increased dramatically through socialization. Because we have this construct of, oh, women should be this way and men should be this way. You're like, yes, maybe there is a tiny difference. For example, like men are, just on average better at like mental rotation and things like that. But the difference between men and women on average is kind of small. But like if you test them on it, they can sort of test very differently because we, expect, certain genders are good at those things, certain genders are good at other things, and we can emphasize, we can exaggerate, slight differences that are already there. But it's hard to like a lot of times like groups of men and groups of women I think are more different than any individual men and women tend to be on their own. But that's because like we always think of ourselves like our brain is sort of separate, but our brains are really in response. Our brains we aren't who we are independent of everything else. We are who we are given the interactions of ourselves with the people and the world around us. So it's a very complex system. Yes?
I'm just curious, like, what do you know is on the horizon in terms of all the basic bench science around understanding what's going on like in these disorders? Like, I'm just curious, like, where things might be heading, or what are some of the more exciting possibilities on the horizon in terms of
Well,
treatment?
one of the things that I mentioned this before that my lab is working on, we're working on a new brain stimulation device. So there are a lot of, we know all these different regions that are active in depression, so different devices have been developed to like, well, why don't we just try stimulating that region instead of using a chemical that goes everywhere. And so I think like transcranial magnetic stimulation, they're sort of improving, trying to figure out which region they should target. Deep brain stimulation, they're improving, except that unfortunately requires surgery. This technology we're working on uses focused ultrasound beams to sort of vibrate regions deep in the brain and change their activity. But unfortunately that's like, at least 5 or 10 years away from actually helping anyone. But they're trying to understand, we were talking earlier how there's like 50 different dopamine receptors. And just trying to understand like, okay, well the subtypes of certain dopamine receptors might, be more important in depression and whatever. And so, we can develop drugs that target more specifically one or the other. Now, given that our drugs haven't really improved in their efficacy in the last like 30 years, dramatically, like they've gotten much better at reduce side effects, but they haven't like gotten so much better at treating people. I don't think we're necessarily going to develop a new drug that's dramatically going to change the way we treat depression. I think we're just going to get better and better at identifying, okay, you're a person that has, high anterior cingulate activity and you have this genetic marker and this is, and you're a man and you have this, social interaction. So like, you're probably going to respond best to this medication. And combined with exercise or whatever. Like we'll get better at understanding for you what's going to be most likely to help you, and instead of just 2/3 of the people benefiting to a given medication, maybe we'll, by better targeting the medication, we'll push that to 80 or 90%. I don't think we're ever going to eliminate depression, and I don't think we can fully understand how to treat it, partially because of this complex dynamic system. Just like we're gonna get better at predicting the weather as time goes on, we'll be able to predict like, oh, what's the weather gonna be, now we know in 3 days what it's gonna be. Then, in 50 years we'll know what it's gonna be 10 days from now. But we're never gonna be perfect. And so I think as our understanding improves, we're gonna just, shorten the amount of time that it takes to treat someone from depression and get more people treated. But I think are we probably running out of time? Let's take one more
Okay.
question back here.
I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for your presentation.
Oh,
It was
sure.
very informative. I really appreciate your passion about all this brain science, and I also appreciate you being really clear about the fact that we don't have any tests to prove, what's going on in the brain completely, and that we're still really in the dark on a lot of this stuff. With that all being said, working in this treatment and being a new practitioner, I'm very passionate about all these things too. Exercise, yoga, all this stuff. And sometimes I run up against a wall with the patients where they'll say, this sounds like hard work. I'd rather just take a pill and make it better.
Right.
And from somebody who has more experience in working with clients, like what's one approach that you might take to that or something?
That's good. Yeah, no, unfortunately I'm a researcher, so I don't
okay.
have the same challenges as you, but, trying to explain, just briefly, like, how these other interventions can help increase the likelihood of the medication working.
Okay.
That can be one strategy because, it's true, like, if you give one person medication, they only, probably have a 30-40% chance of getting all the way better. 30% chance of, they'll get somewhat better. And so just to increase their chances of getting better. And, once they start taking the medication too, it might make these other life changes easier. So you don't actually have to, if they, are resistant to doing a lot at once, just start with one thing and then move on to the
I'd
next.
like to say at 40 years of practice,
Yeah.
I haven't had one patient get a complete remission
Oh.
with just,
With medication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With just medication.
But like once they start, maybe the medication helps them, go from here to here,
Absolutely.
and then they become more receptive to other interventions. I mean, part of the reason I'm hesitant about presenting all that information is like if you're interacting with a client, you shouldn't present them all the innovation because that's overwhelming.
Yeah.
But just like you could pick what the best thing. And I guess if I could just finish, like if you get someone to do something that's the simplest thing to explain, I would suggest go for a walk in the morning.
Okay.
Okay? Because like exercise, it is exercise, but it doesn't sound that difficult. Like just walk outside, walk around the block, come back in. But that activates.
On behalf of Sovereign Health.
Thank you so much.
Blessings too. I thought that was a raffle item because I was looking at it like, okay.
Wow, this is nice. Thank you so much. And
Do you have copies of your book?
yes, I do have copies. So if you'd like to a copy of my book, this is The Upward Spiral. It was just featured in an article in Time magazine. Just started selling really well, which is good. This is my copy, but I have other copies that don't have post-it notes. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.